What is going on, my A-Push Nation? It is Mr. Majewski, and I am here to get you through pages 1 through 5 of the U.S. and Isolationism and the Road to World War II. So without further ado, let's get right into it. We're going to start with kind of a theme, kind of a general statement to set things up. In the wake of the First World War, so after the First World War, the U.S. in the 1920s fell back into a political isolationism in regards to Europe. Now, we know that that's kind of a long tradition, dating back to our first president, Washington, and that throughout most American history, we had maintained this isolationist position, with a few minor exceptions, right? Obviously, imperialism is a period when we were not isolationist. And World War I. Okay, well, we were isolationists in World War I before we got involved. But I think kind of afterwards, during the fighting, I guess we should say, during the war, by getting involved, right, we kind of went back and away from our isolationist tendencies. We lapsed into political isolationism regarding European affairs, although we remained active in economic affairs. And we supported what are going to be called paper agreements that really didn't do much to ultimately preserve the peace. All right, let's get into some of these examples. So during the 20s and the Great Depression, the United States was very isolationist, one of our most isolationist periods. Remember, Warren Harding had promised to return us to normalcy, which was a code word for isolationism. And of course, Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, the men that followed, maintained that tradition because these three conservative presidents believed that isolationism was the best approach for U.S. foreign policy. In July of 21, because we had never signed the Versailles Treaty, and we never joined the League of Nations, which obviously crippled the League, we signed our own separate peace treaty, ending the war with Germany and the Central Powers, which is unique. We ended up just going and signing our own because we didn't want to adhere to the rules of the Versailles Treaty or the League of Nations. And so what we did is afterwards, as we get into the 1920s, we wouldn't promise to go to war with any, to support someone or another country. But we did participate in symbolic peace agreements or peace treaties that I think kind of gave us and the rest of the world a false sense of security, that if a problem broke out, we would be there to respond to it, while in reality, when problems do break out, we kind of ignore them. We refer to those as paper tigers or paper treaties that look good on paper, but unless you're going to enforce them, they're not really worth the ink on the paper. The first example of that is the Washington Disarmament Conference. Why was there a need for it? Well, there were some threats to peace. We have a naval arms race after World War I, and the leading countries are the United States, Britain, and Japan. They're all racing to build their new navies. In particular, we're starting to see the building of more battleships, and in particular, we're going to start to see the emergence of aircraft carriers now that aircraft has been used by the military after World War I. Our Secretary of State, a guy named Charles Evans Hughes, organized the conference. It took place in Washington, D.C., and the goal was naval disarmament. So we want to limit the number of naval vessels that every country has. The idea, of course, being more manageable-sized navies, less likely for conflict to break out between individual ships in those navies. And we also wanted to handle the fact that there was instability in Asia related to politics. So at the Washington Disarmament Conference, the five-power treaty was signed. What it did was it established a ratio by which each country was able to build battleships. Battleships had been the most important ship since 1900. Those are, of course, the big ships with the big giant guns on them. And so we wanted, in the United States, to kind of maintain similar sizes with Britain and to always have kind of an advantage, more of these battleships than any of our rivals, including Japan. So at the Washington Disarmament Conference, the five-power treaty was signed, and what it said, for every 5 U.S. battleships, Britain could have 5, so we would have equal number, and Japan would agree to build just 3. The rationale there was that the U.S. and British had territories in the Atlantic and the Pacific, so therefore they needed more ships to protect both sides, whereas the Japanese obviously only had possessions in the Pacific. Italy and France were allowed to build 1.75 battleships for every 3 that Japan built and for every 5 that the U.S. and Britain built. So ultimately, the goal here of the United States is to maintain the same sort of naval power with Britain, so Britain cannot really get stronger than them, and to always have a larger battleship fleet than Japan, Italy, and France. Of course, Germany, not a part of this. They're still in the midst of devastation from the Versailles Treaty. Also, at the five-power treaty, in order to get Japan to agree to having less battleships than the U.S. and Britain, the U.S. and Britain agreed they wouldn't fortify their bases in Asia. Fortification of bases usually was an indication you planned on staying there a long period. That's something the U.S. did not do. Later on, there's going to be other power treaties that are going to be signed as well. There's going to be a 4-power treaty and eventually a 9-power treaty. All these did was maintain these ratios, while at the same time kind of adding more countries to it. And for instance, the 9-power treaty tried to preserve the open door policy in China that the U.S. had been fighting for since imperialism. Loopholes, ways that countries got around it. Well, there were only restrictions on battleships. There were no restrictions on smaller warships. So Japan especially, and other countries, simply started to build smaller warships. And more importantly, there was no enforcement. Let's say Japan broke the ratio. Let's say Britain built more battleships than the United States. Well, hey, if the United States isn't going to enforce it, isn't going to stand up to Japan and say, destroy those ships or else we'll destroy them for you, then there's no enforcement mechanism. There's nobody backing this treaty up. It's just a paper treaty that doesn't have any physical backing by any of the countries who are involved in it. So, it's like a rule that's established, but if it is broken, there are really no consequences for it, which really oftentimes leads to more bad behavior. Next up, when it comes to isolationism, is the loans, the reparations. Of course, loans we gave out to allied nations during the war to help them win World War I. And reparations, of course, are repair payments, payments that are made by the losers to the winners in order to help the winners repair and recover for their losses. So, hey, after World War I, the U.S. emerged as the leading creditor. We had loaned a ton of money out during World War I since we weren't involved in it throughout most of it. And so those countries owed us more money than anybody else in the world. So we, at this point, are a creditor nation where the rest of the world owes us more money than any other country in the world. The amount that they owed us outweighed the amounts that we owed them. And we wanted our money. After the war, we made it clear we want our debts paid back. The Europeans protested. The British and the French protested, arguing, hey, we're struggling to recover. We were most affected by World War I. Why can't you just maybe forgive the payments? Because there was a belief perhaps the United States didn't need them that much since their economy was booming throughout most of the 1920s. In order for Britain and France to pay the United States back its loans, they needed money that they didn't have. So as part of the Versailles Treaty, they forced Germany to sign the treaty that forced Germany to pay billions and billions of dollars of payments, penalty payments, called reparations to Britain and France. The German economy ends up collapsing in 1923 under the weight of those tremendous payments they were being forced to pay. In response to the payments stopping, France actually invaded a little portion of Western Germany known as the Ruhr, and they occupied it, and they started taking the resources there. What Germany's response to having to pay these reparations is they just massively start printing more paper money to pay off their debts. What that leads to is hyperinflation, which was the same thing, if you remember, that happened in the South at the end of the Civil War, where the money essentially became penniless in the new German government, which was known at the time as the Weimar Republic, a democracy that was instituted after World War I. The thing is here, the United States is really the driving force, because if the U.S. cancels its debt, its payments that are owed to it by France and Britain. France and Britain then do not go to Germany for the reparations. So indirectly, the United States was responsible in some ways for helping Hitler to rise to power because of this debt crisis. In 1924, the debt payments are slowing down. And so President Coolidge appointed a guy named Charles Dawes to go over and try to fix the problem. What he did was he set up a new payment schedule. So he rescheduled German payments. He delayed them and spread them out over a longer period. And then, now this is genius. This is so American here. We loaned Germany money so they could pay back their loans to Britain and France, so that Britain and France could then pay the United States the money that was owed to them. You need to understand what this means. The U.S. is going to get their money paid back from Britain and France with interest that we loaned during World War I, and then we're going to be able to get interest and loan money back from Germany for having loaned them the money so they could pay Britain. Like, this is us making money in two different ways off of the same transaction, which is kind of crazy. So the U.S. credit did help the reparation issue, at least until the Great Depression, when the U.S. economy collapsed. That was no longer the case, and the credit and the payments are going to stop. Other examples of how the U.S. didn't really cooperate with Europe after the war: the U.S. refused to cancel World War I era tariffs and debts. Again, a wonderful image that kind of shows to you what the U.S. did. $2.5 billion in war debt payments. Or loans from the U.S. to Germany, so that Germany can pay $2 billion back in reparations to England and France, the other allies, so that England and France can then pay $2.5 billion to the United States. Right? We get interest back from Germany on these payments, and we get our money back from Britain and France along with the interest owed on those loans. Genius. Peace treaties in the 1920s were ineffective, folks. They just weren't very effective whatsoever. We already talked about how Washington Disarmament Conference was kind of pointless because nobody actually enforced it when countries like Japan started building more battleships anyways. Also, the Kellogg-Briand Pact is signed as well. There was a lot of unrest in Europe. There were concerns that Japan might invade portions of China, which they end up doing. And so in 1928, 62 countries ratified a treaty that made it illegal to go to war except for defensive purposes. So if a country declared war on another country, the rest of the treaty members were supposed to step in and go to war to support or to prevent, to help their fellow treaty mate or to prevent the aggressor from taking over the attacked country. So they tried to declare war illegal, unless it was for defensive purposes. But again, no mechanism for enforcement. So when Japan breaks this rule, when Italy breaks the rule, when Germany breaks the rule, nothing is done to stop them, which only motivates them to do it even more. Again, this gives the U.S. a false sense of security, gave us this false belief that we were safe, and that this treaty would protect us from aggression in Europe and would prevent further conflicts from breaking out. The biggest reason why totalitarianism rises in Germany and Japan is the Great Depression. Of course, we remember the stock market crash leads to a worldwide depression. The U.S. is hammered by it. The European country most devastated, Germany, over 50% unemployment. And, of course, we have that hyperinflation that's going to break out as well. Of course, Japanese exports fall as well by 50% because of the fallout from the Depression. And of course, what happens then is that as Japan starts to blame the West, starts to blame the United States and the Allies for their tariffs, their trade policies, eventually Japanese military steps in. They overthrow the government, they seize control, they assassinate the prime minister, and they begin a more hostile militaristic approach. Folks, the other major change to U.S. policies in the 1920s and 30s, other than the huge isolationism, is we're going to start to give up our imperialist possessions as well. Not before, throughout the 20s, we intervened in the Caribbean and Central America almost at will. For instance, at one point in 1924, 14 different countries in Latin America were controlled by the United States. Remember, the Roosevelt Corollary said we could step into these places anytime if we thought that they were threatened because of financial instability. What we're going to start to see, the U.S. troops are going. And so at one point we were in 14 different countries at one time. The U.S. does remove troops from the Dominican Republic. However, we did keep them in Haiti, for instance, all the way up until 1934. President Coolidge pulls troops out of Nicaragua and then ends up sending them back a year later. So again, it's almost like a revolving door a lot of the time where we are intervening. And this is actually an image of Uncle Sam. You see how Uncle Sam's been turned into like a pirate, like a buccaneer, like a brute? This is an early 20th century cartoon published by the Anti-Imperialist League that's criticizing our imperialism in Latin America, basically arguing we've become a pirate, we've become a brute, we've become kind of the bad guys in our efforts to try to dominate the rest of the continent, of the hemisphere. Another famous issue that happens here, in 1925, Mexico nationalized its oil fields. Most of the oil fields at the time were controlled by American companies. When a country nationalizes, it means the government takes over and takes those possessions from the companies. It's usually a first step towards socialism or communism. What happens is, under pressure from the oil company executives, President Coolidge sends down an ambassador. Mexico agreed to allow the United States companies to keep all of their oil fields they owned before 1917, but everything after 1917 became possessions of Mexico. Many Mexicans were outraged by this because they still felt the U.S. was too involved in their country, dominated their economy. Of course, one of the great resources Mexico has is oil, and so when the United States companies are taking that and bringing that wealth back to the United States, it tends to cause Mexico to not be able to benefit economically or to grow. The Clark Memorandum, 1928 as well, is when things start to really change. In 1928, Reuben Clark, our Secretary of State, promises we'll never intervene in Latin America again. This is a rejection of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. However, we would still intervene for our own defense. So we're starting to shift away from imperialism. Our isolationism is actually also going to apply to, to our own possessions in the Western Hemisphere as well. And that's going to take us to FDR and his continuation of what Hoover had started. FDR's policy to Latin America was known as the Good Neighbor Policy. Sounds like something from State Farm or something. It was a reaction to a lot of the overseas aggression in the 30s. We wanted unity and stability in our part of the world, since there seemed like there was so much instability that was brewing in Europe and Asia. As a result of this policy, Roosevelt's going to become incredibly popular in Latin America because, as you're going to see, we're going to start to speed up the process of getting rid of many of our Latin American possessions. It was a policy of non-intervention, so Roosevelt said we're no longer going to intervene in these countries, and we're going to actually cooperate with them. We're going to meet with them in an effort to try to come up with common sense solutions that we can all agree to enforce and to follow. We sign what are called reciprocal trade agreements with a lot of these countries. These are individual trade deals that the U.S. signs with an individual country. We set up dozens and dozens of these with Latin American countries. We found what's called the PanAmerican Conferences, and we hold them kind of every couple of years during this period. At the 7th PanAmerican Conference, which was in Montevideo in South America, the U.S. promised we will never intervene in your internal or external affairs, Latin America, and that's when we start to withdraw from places like Nicaragua, Haiti, which was the first time troops had not been there since 1915. We repealed the Platt Amendment, so we're no longer controlling Cuba and their constitution. In 1936, we signed the Buenos Aires Conference in Argentina. It says all disputes between the U.S. and Latin America would be settled by international arbitrators or judges who would decide which party was right, and both sides agreed to accept those decisions. 1938, Mexico nationalizes its oil fields again, this time the U.S., since we are now anti-imperialist under Roosevelt, allows that to happen and allows the Mexican government to take its resources for them. This was actually a postage stamp that was supporting or commemorating those Pan-American conferences. The very last thing you need to know is Roosevelt, when he takes over, also established new trade deals with many, many, many countries who we previously did not have. He recognized the Soviet Union in 1933. We passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934 that declared the Philippines would be independent within 10 years, and that's exactly what we do. And then, like I mentioned, we signed these reciprocal trade agreements. We wanted relief and recovery for our economy. We wanted tariffs lowered, or at least FDR did, because he thought they were too high. If we lower our tariffs, the other countries will be able to open up and expand trade with them. And the president actually was authorized to do the negotiations himself, so he could negotiate, or his branch could negotiate these deals with individual countries as well. It reversed our protectionism, our tariff policies that had dominated since the Civil War, since the 1860s. For the first time, we're going to start to see these tariffs move down and eventually get eliminated altogether as we start to embrace a system that is known as free trade, where you open up trade with all countries and eliminate all tariffs with them. All right, we're going to stop it there because that is the cutoff line. I hope that sets things up. Again, a very isolationist time, and I want you to stop and think and ask yourselves, hey, all those policies we talked about, why are they isolationist? What about them is making them isolationist? Remember, while we're physically isolationist, we're still heavily involved in economic matters around the world. But obviously, we don't want to sign any agreements that are going to get us into conflicts that outside of the United States. We don't want to sign any agreements that we feel could cause us to have to intervene in more places as we get into the 1930s. And so we're seeing steady isolationism, ultimately anti-imperialism that starts to spread as well. And these trends are really going to continue throughout much of the 1930s as well, despite the fact these new totalitarian dictators have just risen up. All right, folks, Mr. M signing off here, and hopefully this will help you get through these pages.